Josiah and Edith signed the marriage documents in the cramped office of the River Pine Courthouse. The building smelled of ink, dust, and resignation. The clerk, with a face carved from disinterest, watched them without expression as he slid the papers forward. Two men, local laborers pressed into duty, stood as silent witnesses, eyes flicking between the couple and the clock on the wall. Outside, the sun beat down on cracked earth and whispers curled like smoke through the narrow streets of town. The ink dried quickly, as if eager to end the transaction. There were no rings, no vows spoken aloud, no softening of eyes. Just the scratch of the pen, the thud of a stamp, and the shuffle of papers being filed away into drawers that had seen too many names and not enough meaning. They rode back to the farm in silence. The wagon creaked beneath them, wheels stirring up thin clouds of dirt. Edith sat upright, hands folded in her lap, small trunk at her feet. Josiah held the reins loosely, eyes fixed on the horizon, jaw set. Neither turned to look at the other. The land rolled out around them, dry and wide, broken by fences and fields that hadn't seen enough rain. The sky overhead stretched pale and endless. When they reached the house, Josiah helped her down without a word. The farmhouse stood like a watchful witness. 2 floors, weathered siding, and windows that reflected too much sky. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke and linseed oil. Edith stepped into the front room and paused. 2 bedrooms, one to the left, one to the right. A single kitchen in the back. Furniture plain, arranged with precision, nothing out of place, nothing personal. She chose the room to the right, unpacking slowly. Dresses hung one by one, her brush set beside a pitcher on the washstand. She held the reins loosely, eyes fixed on the horizon. Chases hung one by one, her brush set beside a pitcher on the washstand. Behind the closed door, she could hear the front door open and close again. Josiah had gone to the stables. She didn't expect him back for supper. She didn't cook. That night, the house was filled with the sounds of separate lives. The door creaked, boots scuffed on the floorboards. A kettle boiled and was poured, but no voices called across the hallway. No footsteps approached. The walls, though thin, seemed to absorb everything. Not just sound, but tension, distance, the weight of something chosen out of necessity and not desire. Over the following days, a rhythm emerged. Edith rose early, washed, swept the floor, and baked bread that she didn't offer. Josiah returned from the fields at dusk, his hands rough with dust and work, eating in silence and retreating to his room. Chores were performed without coordination yet never collided. Tools gore, she could hear the front door open and close again. Josiah had gone to the stables. She didn't expect him back for supper. She didn't cook. That night, the house was filled with the sounds of separate lives. The door creaked even the same point to disease. 3 same place for papers and safe in the same place, and then he's in seeming point to do with differentity to the joy, because the torn and welcome bees and tracing. Area sub to the stables. She didn't expect him back for supper. She didn't cook. That night, the house was filled with the sounds of separate lives. The door creaked, boots scuffed on the floorboards. The kettle boiled and was poured, but no voices called across the hallway. No footsteps approached the walls. The thin seemed to absorb everything. Not just sound, but tension, distance, the weight of something chosen out of necessity, and not just sound, but tension, distance, the weight of something chosen out of necessity and not desire. Over the following days, a rhythm emerged. Edith rose early, but every so often, their eyes met. Not long, not lingering, just enough to register presence. In those glances was something taut, not affection, not yet even respect, but an awareness. Waiting, like 2 people standing in a doorway, neither wanted to be the first to enter. No one said it aloud, but the question lingered between them, echoing softly through the quiet house. Which one of us will regret this first? In the days that followed, Edith moved through the farmhouse like someone carefully unfolding a letter written in an unfamiliar hand. The kitchen was the first to change. Without seeking permission or offering explanations, she shifted the plates from the upper shelves to the lower ones, washed the window glass until it caught the morning light, and unpacked a linen tablecloth from her trunk, pale blue with stitched violets along the border, delicate against the worn wood of the table. She folded it precisely, smoothing the edges each morning. Josiah noticed the changes even if he didn't acknowledge them. At first, there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes when he reached for a spoon and found it elsewhere, or the coffee tin was no longer on the high shelf. But he said nothing. Silence had always been his defense, one he wore like a second skin, and so he watched instead. From the days that followed, Edith moved through the farmhouse like someone carefully unfolding a letter written in offensive familiar. Edith woke early, always before him. By the time he crossed the hallway in the morning, the stove was already warm. A faint trace of yeast and wood smoke clung to the air. She baked bread before the sun rose fully, shaping the dough with quiet, steady hands. His shirts, once stiff from days of sweat and dust, began to reappear folded neatly on the bench outside his room, the fabric softened by careful washing. He never asked her to do these things. She never explained why she did them. The house began to smell different. Not sweet, not perfumed, just not empty. It was cinnamon one morning, soap and lemon oil another. It no longer echoed in the same way. Footsteps were matched by the creak of floorboards. Cabinet doors opened and closed with purpose. There was a rhythm to the days now, not shared exactly, but parallel. That much was clear in the way she dressed, in the way she stood, straight-backed and composed, even when the wind kicked up dust that settled into every crack. Her manners were too formal for the territory. She poured tea into her cup with both hands, never rushed her speech, never raised her voice. Yet she did not pretend to be someone else. She made no effort to harden herself to match the town's edge. Josiah observed her quietly. The way she knelt by the hearth to mend her boot, needle flashing in the firelight. The way she didn't flinch when the butcher barked at a boy in the shop. The way she folded her letters even when they were only lists. He found himself noticing her more often, as though the stillness he'd relied on all these years had shifted its weight. The townsfolk began to notice her too. At first, their glances were sidelong, tight-lipped. They called her that new wife in hushed tones. But over time, the suspicion dulled. She stopped to speak to the grocer's daughter about flour. She nodded to the preacher's wife outside the chapel. When she left the tailor shop one afternoon with a scrap of calico, someone muttered, "Not that woman, but Mrs. Barlow." The name landed differently each time it was spoken, as though it had found soil it could take root in. Not fully grown, not yet, but planted. It began with smoke curling under the doorframe, thin and acrid. Josiah woke with a start, the scent too sharp to be mistaken. For a moment he sat upright in the dark, lungs tight with disbelief. Then came the crackling, distant but fierce, and he was on his feet, barefoot, fumbling for trousers and a bucket. By the time he reached the back door, the night was already torn open by firelight. The barn was burning, not fully, not yet, but enough for panic to grip his chest. Flames licked at the far wall where the hay was stacked. He ran, boots forgotten. He didn't shout. He didn't question. He joined her. Together they pulled open gates and guided out the animals, slapping their flanks, waving smoke from their eyes. They passed the bucket back and forth with a rhythm born of necessity. Their hands met, wet and shaking. Their faces were streaked with ash and sweat. They didn't stop to think. There was no time for fear or formality. When the last embers were tamped, when the barn stood dark and smoldering but upright, Josiah bent forward with hands on knees, chest heaving. Edith stood nearby, hair plastered to her cheeks, sleeves torn. She didn't speak. Neither did he, but his eyes found her in the quiet that followed, not to check if she was injured, not to confirm she was real, but because something had shifted. The woman before him was no longer unfamiliar. She was his equal, forged beside him in fire and night. By dawn, the sky was soft and sallow with smoke. Edith moved through the kitchen like sleep had never come. She boiled bones from the larder, added herbs, scraped carrots and onions without pause. The scent of broth curled through the house like a balm. When she set the bowl before him, she didn't meet his eyes. Her hands were red from washing, the sleeves of her dress still damp. Josiah sat down slowly, spoon in hand. He looked at her, really looked, and he said it. The first word since the courthouse. "Thank you." She nodded once, a quiet reply in place of 1,000 sentences. Something changed after that. Not dramatically. Not like a door flung wide. More like a window, cracked just enough for air to move. They spoke now, not often, not long, but enough. Short phrases over bread and grain. A question about nails. A comment on the weather. Josiah began repairing the sagging corner of the roof, and she handed him boards without needing to be asked. She salted bowls and stacked firewood. He dug trenches for rainwater runoff. Together they checked the pantry shelves, counted jars, sealed crates. There was a rhythm forming. Not quite harmony, but a pattern. Not yet trust, but something approaching it. In the small, shared tasks of preparing for the coming cold, there was a sense of alignment, of purpose shared if not spoken. And as the light shifted toward autumn, so did they. Not with warmth, but with steadiness. Not with affection, but with respect. And that, for now, was more than either had expected. The wind turned colder in early October, bringing with it a sharpness that made the boards creak and the windows groan. Edith found an old woolen blanket tucked at the back of the armoire, frayed at the edges, its stitches loosening where time had tugged hardest. She took to mending it by the window each afternoon, the fading sun catching on her needle as it moved steadily through worn fibers. The fabric smelled of cedar and dust, and her hands, though stiff from work, moved with a patient rhythm. Josiah, meanwhile, spent time in the shed behind the house. He gathered spare planks and sorted through rust and nails, measuring and cutting with a quiet focus. In the evenings, the sound of hammering echoed through the yard. When the shelf was finished, he brought it inside without a word and set it beneath the window in the sitting room. It wasn't ornate, but it was smooth, solid. Edith placed her small collection of books on it, spines worn, pages thinned by years, and stepped back as though completing something important. At night, the fire in the hearth was the only light. Edith sat nearest, mending or reading, the patched blanket sometimes across her knees. Josiah took the other chair, a few feet away, holding old letters in his hands. The envelopes were yellowed, edges soft with time. They were written in a fine, looping hand, his sister's, and though he never read them aloud, his eyes lingered on each line like memory alone could answer something unfinished. Eventually, he spoke. Not much, not often. One evening, he told her how his sister used to play the fiddle in the mornings, how they'd spent a year living in a tent after the flood. Edith listened with quiet attention, threading her needle without looking down. In turn, she shared pieces of her own past, how she once dreamed of teaching, how she'd nearly boarded a train to Boston once but stayed out of duty instead. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't expect sympathy. It was enough to be heard. No one asked for closeness. She didn't reach for his hand and he never leaned in. But there were moments when she set tea beside him without being asked, or when he filled the woodpile so she wouldn't have to go out in the frost. It spoke of something growing in the quiet. One afternoon, he returned from town with a small paper-wrapped parcel. He placed it on the corner of the table and left beside the computer. Placed it on the corner of the table and left without comment. When she unfolded it, she found a wooden comb, smooth and dark, carved with tiny flowers along the spine. Her breath caught. It was not expensive, not polished, but it was made with time and care. She placed it carefully on her dressing table, between a porcelain dish and a faded brooch from her mother. The comb fit there as though it had always belonged. That night, the fire crackled low and their chairs sat the same distance apart. No words passed between them, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. It held something settled, like a page after a finished paragraph. In that house of creaking floors and changing light, there was still no touch, no kiss. But when the wind rattled the windows, they stayed seated by the fire, together. And that, in its own quiet way, was enough. The spring thaw softened the earth, turning the stubborn ground into something willing. Josiah brought out the burlap sacks of seed potatoes, and together they crouched in the garden plot behind the barn. Edith wore gloves too thin for the chill still clinging to the morning air, but her fingers moved deftly, tucking each cut tuber into the soil with care. Josiah followed with his boot, pressing the earth down gently. They didn't speak, but their movements aligned, falling into a rhythm born not of planning, but of familiarity. Each morning brought new routines. Edith gathered eggs from the hens, slipping them into a wicker basket lined with scraps of cloth. The hens clucked and fluttered, but she no longer flinched at the noise. Josiah spent his days further out, building a small structure meant to house seasonal workers. When summer came, the air held cities case off from areas my waist. These just sang thaw softened the earth, turning the stubborn ground into something willing. Josiah brought out the burlap sacks of seed potatoes, and together they crouched in the garden plot behind the barn. Edith wore gloves too thin for the chill still clinging to the morning air, but her fingers moved deftly, tightening to his arms spacing buta tape. His only witness in the video was a bigger Susan Souls client in too smarting. The assistant's dog ground into something willing. Josiah brought out the burlap sacks of seed potatoes, and together they crouched in the garden plot behind the barn. Edith wore gloves too thin for the chill still clinging to the morning air, but her fingers moved deftly, tucking each cut tuber into the soil with care. Josiah followed with his boot, putting the earth down gently. They didn't speak, but their movements aligned, falling into a rhythm born not of planning, but of familiarity. Each morning brought new routines. Edith gathered eggs from the hens, slipping them into a wicker basket lined with scraps of cane potatoes. And together they crouched in the garden plot behind the barn. Edith wore gloves too thin for the chill still clinging to the morning air, but her fingers moved deftly, tucking each cut tuber into the soil with care. Josiah followed with a speak to the chills too clinging to the morning air, but her fingers moved deftly, tucking each of the mono-round into something willing. Josiah brought out the burlap sacks of seed potatoes, and together they crouched in the garden plot behind the barn. Edith wore gloves too thin for the chill still clinging to the morning, and Edith's peach shell with his seed for the chill clinging to the morning air, but her fingers moved the finger of down gently. They didn't speak in the siste and Jildra, the mound, and the something with a rethink the tunter upon a valedon continue line of think a seized time on row one. He didn't think still or willing to candies calm as into John Amson to bump Peter Singers and tear mouth thinker of bone on king as some tune to chum sound and knock and the sing funnest in particular thinking to time a sink out and to arm to think to know laws and down and first shown and tinto and known and timming to the jumpers and combination firm attempted to do and the subverting means to tell him turing can tell well but in both children castrum can down to know minimum game thinker no one in arm and to confirm tempted unknown come parental and something to maintain temper Menomi the team down to non to no one of Canon time on did the item on the content and being them and competing and something they more on being getting one on turn on to mentor now them take something done at a scanton and don't open and so on me a store on me to around the front and compare and pensioner with them come to the moment of them in the town known in town at the dry goods store. They were referred to as the Barlows, no longer as separate names, but one. A clerk handed Edith her flower and said, "Your husband's out early these days." She didn't correct him. Evening softened. The edge in the silence dulled. Edith no longer turned away when Josiah stepped into the house. She'd look up from kneading dough or brushing dust from the windowsill and offer a simple nod. He noticed the way she smiled, just slightly, when one of the hens escaped the garden, flapping wildly and scattering dirt. Once he caught her laughter, light and sudden, and found himself smiling before he could stop it. Sometimes she fell asleep in the armchair by the fire, sewing still in her lap. On those nights, Josiah approached quietly, lifted a folded quilt from the back of the chair, and draped it gently over her shoulders. He never lingered, never touched her skin, but the gesture carried weight, like a sentence left hanging in the air. One evening, the wind had calmed and the fire crackled low. Edith brewed tea, the scent of mint rising with the steam. She walked over, offered a cup to Josiah, and as he reached for it, her fingers brushed his. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. For a moment, the space between them was full of something more than shared chores or seasonal preparation. Josiah looked around the room, the patched windows, the warm floorboards, the shadow of the rocking chair against the wall, and said that the house felt warmer now. It wasn't just the fire. Edith held his gaze and replied, her voice quiet, that she hadn't expected to stay in this place by choice, that it was no longer need that kept her here, but something gentler, something she hadn't thought would grow. They both smiled, soft and genuine, not the beginning of something grand, but the recognition of something real. Outside, the sky blushed faintly with the promise of longer days. The earth was still damp, the work far from done, but inside the house, something had taken root. Something that asked nothing and offered everything, in its own quiet way. The heat of summer had settled deep into the Colorado earth, turning fields golden and heavy with promise. In the weeks leading to the harvest celebration, the town of Plainfield stirred with quiet anticipation. Bunting was hung across shop fronts. The scent of pies and roasted corn drifted from kitchen windows, and hands that spent all year building, planning, and repairing finally paused to acknowledge the season's yield. Edith sat by the window with a pair of shears and a folded length of fabric the color of wild lavender. The cloth was soft, brought back by Josiah from a trading post nearly 3 towns over. He had handed it to her wrapped in brown paper, wordless as always, but his eyes had waited, hoped for her approval. She had said anything, just smoothed the fabric between her palms and begun to plan peel. The dress was simple, modest, and fit close to the waist. The heat of summer had settled deep into the Colorado earth, turning fields golden and heavy with promise. In May there is an owen basing to see thrive used to core into self-thing, to bring males in a season shield. Edith sat by the window with a pair of shears and a folded length of fabric the color of wild lavender. To keep the summer had Teria that the kind of conceptors there Edith sees wading to the Colorado earth, turning fields golden and heavy with promise. In the weeks leading to the harvest celebration, the town of Plainfield stirred with quiet anticipation. Point fires out Silvo Conroads the rate of commerce self and filled bolden and heavy with promise. In the weeks leading to the harvest celebration, the town of Plainfield stirred with quiet anticipation. Bunting was hung across shop fronts, the scent of pies and roasted corn drifted from kitchen windows. The hands that spent all year building, planting, and repairing finally paused to acknowledge the season's yield. Edith sat by the window with a pair of shears and a folded length of fabric the color of wild lavender. The cloth was soft, brought back by Josiah from a trading post Dale's Punquio was chopped from. When she stepped out of their home, Josiah stood waiting by the wagon. He didn't comment, but his gaze lingered longer than usual. At the fairgrounds, music floated across the dry fields and laughter curled through the stalls. Edith and Josiah walked side by side past tables of preserves, bundles of herbs, and pies still warm in their tins. Townsfolk glanced their way. Some nodded, some whispered. A few smiled in passing recognition. The murmur of the past, of paper marriages and closed doors, had grown quieter with time, buried beneath their steady rhythm. Without ceremony, Josiah reached for her hand. His fingers were calloused, the grip sure but gentle. It was the first time he had done that outside their home, in the gaze of others. Edith did not react with surprise. She simply held on, walking beside him as if this had always been their pace. As the sun dipped low and the fair began to quiet, they rode home together, the cart filled with jars of honey, a bag of seed, and the quiet weight of something unspoken but understood. The dirt road stretched ahead of them, familiar now, carved by repeated steps and shared labor. Back at the farmhouse, Edith stepped down first, opened the door without waiting. The inside smelled of bread and dried lavender. She lit the lamp, set the kettle to boil, plumped the pillows on the sofa. Her movements were unhurried, practiced. She moved like someone who belonged. Josiah lingered on the porch. The house, once little more than timber and obligation, now held a softness he hadn't known how to hope for. It no longer looked saved. It looked lived in, and that made all the difference. Inside, Edith left the door to his room ajar, not by accident, but invitation. The kettle whistled softly in the background. When Josiah, Edith left the door to his room ajar, not by accident, but invitation. The kettle whistled softly in the background. When Josiah hand tender pair-to-keep reverberation thread softly's deep pages. As the sun dipped low and the fair began to quiet, they rode home together, the cart filled with jars of honey, a bag of seed, and the quiet weight of something unspoken. But understood and hindered, he did not knock, did not announce himself. He simply came in and remained. She turned toward him as the lamplight caught the side of his face. Her voice was quiet but clear. She told him that he was no longer her duty, no longer a decision made on someone else's terms. He was her choice. He nodded once, nothing grand, nothing rehearsed, but the weight of it settled around him like the final line in a letter too long unsent. There were still no declarations, no confessions, just the warm hum of shared space. The tea cooled, the night deepened, and in the hush of their home, a truth bloomed. Not loud, not sudden, but real. They were no longer strangers made family by necessity. They were no longer man and woman navigating parallel silences. They were Josiah and Edith, by name, by will. And that, at last, was enough.